Good evening. Welcome to the Sugarloaf campus of Chestnut Hill College and to the Institute for Religion and Science at Chestnut Hill College. A particularly warm welcome to those who are here for the first time, and I know we have a few. So it's very fine that you were able to join us. We were established about 8 years ago to promote the constructive engagement of religion and spirituality with science and technology, and to encourage dialogue that's interfaith, multi-science, and civil. And so I hope we've worked a little bit toward that during those years. We have a bunch of videos on our website that if you've missed anything the last few years, you can always make up time by watching those. And that's one of the things we do. We do a lot of videos, a lot of lectures and videotape them. And we have a reading discussion club with very faithful members who really do their reading. And it's a joy to be with them. And so if you haven't been with us before and you want to be on our mailing list to find out about future events, please sign up with Sammy Jo in the back. She'll be glad to put your name there. And so finally, I'll just tell you about the way the evening will flow. In the last couple of years, we've been changing the system, and it's always good to do that once in a while. And so what we do, we'll have our speaker give his lecture, but then we'll stop for a while. We'll stop, and I'll ask you to form a small circle of maybe 4, 5, 6 people, not too big, because if it's too big, then you don't get a chance to talk. And maybe discuss with the other members something that you've heard, questions that you have, that kind of thing. And then we'll stop after maybe 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and have a chance to ask questions or have comments or whatever with our speaker. So I'm really happy to introduce this evening someone who I've known for a long time, for many years. Our speaker, Daryl Domning, and Peter Donson, who is on our advisory committee, and I, and he's here with us tonight, and I have met for many years, maybe 20? We won't tell them. How many years we've been meeting down at Loyola University in Maryland to discuss with other scientists, the connection between science and religion. And that's kind of interesting because we try to eliminate the theologians in order to be able to be free enough to explore. As scientists, however, we usually have some really good theologians come and join us too. But we've been together for a while, so it's a pleasure to have Daryl with us this evening. So Dr. Daryl Domning is professor of anatomy at Howard University in Washington, D.C. He received his PhD in 1975 from the University of California at Berkeley. His research focuses as a paleontologist on the evolution of marine mammals, particularly sirenians, thank you, and desmopilians. How's that? Not too bad. His fieldwork takes him to many places, such as Jamaica, Austria, France, Libya, Mexico, and I hear we were visiting the same city, Ahmedabad, in India. And as secretary of the board of directors of Save the Manatee Club, Daryl is an advocate for presentation of the manatee, a prehistoric sea cow. So immersed in this study of evolution like Teilhard, Daryl has also developed an interest in its theological implications and is active in science-religion activities and dialogue, and has published articles on topics such as original selfishness, original sin, and evil in light of evolution. And that was done with Monica Hellwig. And another article he published in America was called Evolution, Evil, and Original Sin. He was a co-organizer and speaker at the Washington Theological Union's public conference series called Adam, A-T-O-M, by the way, and Eve, Using Science and Pastoral Ministry. So it's good to have you with us, Daryl, especially to have an evolutionary scientist who can really speak, from Teilhard's perspective in a way that, others don't always have. So please welcome Dr. Daryl Domning to the Institute for Religion and Science at Chestnut Hill College.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Well, if we're going to talk about evolution, it's logical to start off talking about this fellow whom you all know, called the father of modern evolutionary biology, and this does in fact have a theological connection. Get this, oops, sorry, find all the buttons. Jack Haught, the well-known theologian, Georgetown University, has called modern evolutionary biology Darwin's great gift to theology, and I would certainly agree with that because it does help to solve certain theological problems. But we should start by saying that although you associate him with the term evolution, he certainly did not come up with the idea of evolution himself. That was in the air very much for a couple of generations before Darwin. What he did was introduce the concept of natural selection. It's right there on his title page, Origin of Species in 1859. And natural selection was the idea that finally made the idea of evolution itself plausible to scientists. The notion had been sort of oversimplified as survival of the fittest, but that at least reminds you of what it's all about. Now, we also have this gentleman you also know, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was an evolutionist. He's a Jesuit priest, a paleontologist like myself, geologist. But when it came to theology, the notion of evolution made clear to him from the beginning that the notion of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden simply wasn't going to fly. Even in the early 20th century, enough was known about paleontology and geology that the idea of the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve simply wasn't going to work. But he was also, while being certainly an evolutionist, he was not a Darwinian. He, as we'll mention a bit later, didn't really grasp the notion of natural selection. Why that was, you can get a hint of from just looking at his dates here, and the fact that he came of age in the early 20th century. His ideas were formed in the early 20th century at a time when the idea of natural selection itself was actually at a low ebb among biologists. That was the time around 1900 and just thereafter that the work of Gregor Mendel in genetics was just being rediscovered, and it wasn't until the 1940s or so that that body of thought on genetics, together with the idea of natural selection, were brought together into what we call the modern synthesis or the neo-Darwinian synthesis. But while Teilhard was in his formative years, that was still in the future. Also, well, he was French, and Darwin was British. And so that British idea of natural selection was not received in France to the same extent that it was in the English-speaking world for quite a while. So as Teilhard was developing his ideas, it was without taking natural selection into account. He hardly ever mentions it in any of his writings. It was not part of his toolbox of ideas, really. And as you probably know, one of the things he was criticized for from the outside, from the onset, was that he seemingly didn't take evil and sin very seriously. At least that was what people said about him. He didn't seem to have a clear idea of how sin and evil fit into the evolutionary picture that he was advocating. And I've said elsewhere that this was a tragedy because if he had thought deeply about natural selection, that might well have given him the explanation that he needed for sin and evil. Well, let's see how this developed. Starting with where the Catholic Church was at the time Teilhard came into this whole picture. And we can go back to the 16th century, the Council of Trent. Of course, there was major thought expended on the subject of original sin before this. You can trace it back to St. Paul in Romans, certainly St. Augustine around year 400 developed this idea of original sin. But it sort of was set in concrete here in 1546 with the decree on original sin by the Council of Trent, which insisted that original sin was transmitted to all of us by propagation, not by imitation. All right? It was something that we actually physically inherited. We would say today genetically inherited, which was originally, in the hands of St. Augustine, an argument that was made in contradiction to the Pelagians at Augustine's time, who were arguing that sin was basically a matter of bad example, that it wasn't something that we physically, genetically inherited. It was something that we all picked up, but through bad example. Well, Augustine strenuously opposed that view, and so Trent is drawing that idea basically from Augustine, but formalizing it in formal church teaching. Okay. What about Teilhard? How did he react to this when he came along and started thinking about it? In 1922, he produced a typescript. It was an unpublished document, about 7 pages, talking about how you might think about what by then was a dogma of the church in the light of evolution. And he pointed out 2 key difficulties with that Adam and Eve story. One was the idea of all humans being descended from a single couple, technically called monogenism, and the idea of this earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden, without suffering, without death, which only came into the world through Adam's fall. Okay, you all know that story very well. Well, Teilhard rejected these ideas based on scientific evidence, what was known at that time and since as well. He saw sin as not something that originated from a single event in fairly recent geological history, but as a condition for all human existence, suffering and death being conditions for all life. As far back as life began, it was ending as well. And this was a view that he essentially held on to for the rest of his life. And he was right to do so, in my opinion. He was correct on those points. Let's see. Oops. Okay. All right. So, well, that typescript of his didn't exactly go viral. They didn't have the internet in those days, but it did circulate privately in samizdat, as the Russians would say, mimeographed copies or whatever, carbon copies or whatever they were using then, privately among his friends, colleagues, students, and so forth. Well, inevitably, it got leaked to the authorities. They got wind of this. Both the Jesuit headquarters in Rome and the Holy Office itself. That's what we used to call the Inquisition. Nowadays we call it the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. At this time it was called the Holy Office. Well, they weren't too keen on it. They mulled it over for about 3 years, and then finally came up with 6 propositions, 6 statements that they wanted Teilhard, as an obedient Jesuit priest, to subscribe to sign his name to, reassuring them that he was still Orthodox, and that was handed to his Jesuit superior, who passed it on to him. And so, by and by, after knocking this around for a few years, Teilhard did agree to sign these statements, only with some reservations. So, interesting thing is, nobody got to see what those propositions actually said until last year, last summer. Did the archives of the Vatican finally give up the actual text of these things? And they were published and analyzed in a very important paper for Teilhardian scholarship here. It was published in Zygon last June by 2 authors by the name of David Grumet and Paul Bentley. Teilhard de Chardin, Original Sin and the 6 Propositions. So this is the place to go if you want more details, but much of this talk tonight is going to be about what was revealed here. What did Teilhard actually have to agree to? Well, number 1, first man, Adam, when he sinned in paradise, immediately lost the holiness and justice in which he had been created. And behold, where that comes from, that's from straight out of the Council of Trent. So is the next one. Sin of Adam damaged not only him, but also his descendants, and he lost holiness and justice not for himself only, but also for us. Likewise, the third one from the Council of Trent here. Sin of Adam, one by origin, passed on to all by propagation and not by imitation. There is that key phrase. Inheres in everyone as something proper to each. So we all inherit it from Adam. Okay, all of that is straight out of Council of Trent. Number 4 is the interesting one. Therefore, the whole human race takes its origin from one proto-parent, Adam. Well, wait a minute, didn't we say that basically back in here? The first man, Adam, and damaged all of his descendants, that would be us, and the sin in here. But if you read these with the mind of a lawyer, a canon lawyer, Yeah, although that idea is definitely implied by what the Council of Trent said, but it's not exactly spelled out explicitly. So if you're a good lawyer, you can work around what Trent says and still be able maybe to argue against this. So anyway, this statement had not, up until 1927 or so, been formally enshrined in church doctrine. But now, for the occasion of these 6 propositions handed to Teilhard, it was finally written down for the occasion. Okay, well, what else was there? Well, now we have something from Vatican I, 1870. Even though faith is above reason, they're not on an equal basis, but faith and reason are never going to contradict each other. This is sort of an article of faith itself. Lots of people have argued with that, but Vatican I said that truth of one or the other kind cannot disagree with the other kind of truth. Moreover, this is an interesting one, it's impossible that even though science keeps progressing and keeps coming up with deeper understandings, or at least new understandings of nature, it's never going to happen that science will come up with a contradiction to what Holy Mother Church has already been teaching. In other words, the Church already has all the answers, even to all the questions of a scientific nature that have never been asked yet. And we are taking it on faith that science not only does not, but never will contradict the teaching of the Church, the dogmas propounded by the Church. Interesting. Okay, well, this is what Teilhard was told he had to subscribe to. So he thought about it for several weeks. He wrote to one of his mentors that the last 2 there from Vatican I didn't really give him a problem. And even numbers 1 through 3 from the Council of Trent were not even very much more difficult for him to accept. But number 4, that one he could not accept as a scientist. If he subscribed to that, it would be strictly on the basis of faith. And even then, he would have to view it as in need of some revisions. So he eventually did sign his acceptance to all 6 of them. And he says, in the full sense that the Holy Church gives to them, despite the appearances that I might have given, I have never had any other idea than to let them, the teachings of the Church, dominate all scientific truth. I can see why he had to ponder that for a while, to bend over backwards and somehow agree to that with some maybe legalistic reservations. It's an interesting question how he managed to arrive at that agreement. And the authors of this paper, in analyzing the record of this, spend quite a bit of time discussing how he might have been able to come to that conclusion. Even how he would have been able to assent to the first 3 and the last 2 of those 6 propositions and say he was doing it with little difficulty. But that number 4, he said he could, Grumet and Bentley say that he could only have accepted it as a dogmatic axiom. Basically, that's what he was saying. It can only be on the basis of faith, not as a scientific proposition. But it was a scientific question. The way it had been worded was a statement about Adam being the progenitor of the entire human race. And Teilhard's knowledge of biology wouldn't let him assent to that as a scientific proposition, but only as a statement of faith. But again, it sort of boggles the mind how he could say one thing and the other at the same time. Not clear how he managed to convince himself of that. But here's a critical point, really. That number 4 was composed for the occasion, and nowhere having been explicitly defined in church teaching up to that point, even in Trent. On what authority was it being proposed? On what authority was he being required to agree to that? And if it was, if it was clearly implied by numbers 1 through 3, which you will agree that it was, I mean, it's hard to see how it needed to be restated, but the Holy Office obviously felt that it needed to be stated clearly. Somehow they detected some ways that a good canon lawyer could get around what was said in Trent, and they had to close those loopholes by the way they phrased that statement number 4. So it seemed that Teilhard was being required to submit to a more restrictive formula than could be justified either logically or historically on the basis of what the church had defined up to that point. Now, we shouldn't get the impression that Teilhard was being uniquely picked on here. This kind of stuff was in the air back in the early 20s. So there's a fair list of other people at the same time who were being interrogated, who were being pressured at the same time that Teilhard was. Jules Touzard here, another French priest, who denied that Moses had actually written the first 5 books of the Bible. Another Jesuit, Pierre Rousselot, who thought that the miracles in the Bible you had to take on faith, otherwise they were rather mind-bending. Another priest, Henri de Dorladeau, was a theistic Darwinist. Gustave Bardi was going too far in accepting the higher criticism which was then coming into the church from the Protestants who in the 19th century had developed the techniques of criticism of literary documents, and that didn't really get the approval of the Catholic Church until the 1940s with an encyclical of Pius XII. But at this time, it was very much frowned on still, so-called higher criticism in biblical studies. So all these cases pretty much had in common things like negotiations between the Vatican and the local authorities, or in the case of the Jesuits, the Jesuit superiors. People were having their jobs being threatened, positions taken away, having to subscribe to written formulas, restrictions on what they could publish. So Teilhard was by no means alone at this time in this sort of censorship. Well, what happened subsequently? He had made strenuous efforts to comply with the demands that were being made of him. He was taking any advice and help that he could get from his friends, his superiors who were sympathetic to him in the Society of Jesus. Nonetheless, he did lose his job. He lost his teaching post in Paris and was exiled to the other side of the world, to China, where he spent the next 20 years pretty much doing some very important foundational work in the geology and vertebrate paleontology of China. And Peter Dodson here can tell us all about that end of it. Although it should be pointed out that he wasn't continuously there in exile for 20 years. He made several trips back to France, and at least one of them, he was back there for like a year and a half or something continuously. So it wasn't that he was banned from re-entering France, but basically he was working in China and continuing to think and write about theology, as well as voluminous works on geology and paleontology, which were published. But his theological writings could not be published during his lifetime. So Grumet and Bentley here say that he might have been viewed as a prudent sacrifice to appease the conservatives, both within the Jesuit order and the Holy Office in the Vatican. Church politics were very much in evidence here. There were theological issues, there were scientific issues to be sure, but a lot of this was church politics. So it was a time of political ferment in the church about things like this. Okay, so he continued writing. Stuff wasn't published, but he had a lot more to say about these topics of original sin and monogenism. He was already being criticized because his writings had been circulating, some of them, in private. And people were already criticizing him for being pretty vague about how sin and evil actually did come about, how they fit into the picture. He would often say things like, well, these are just the dark side of evolution. Okay, what does that mean? Well, he didn't really adequately explain that. But in response to his critics in his unpublished writings, he said he thought he was taking sin and evil more seriously than the traditional Tridentine dogma did, because the traditional teaching was that sin and evil entered the world, the whole known universe, because one guy ate a piece of fruit. That's kind of a trivial sort of event, you would think, whereas Teilhard is saying that they are intrinsic to the fabric of existence itself. The material universe had these potentialities, sin and evil, built into it from the creation. He wasn't any more clear about how that was true, but that was what he intuitively felt. So it was a much, much bigger issue than one piece of fruit being eaten. Yeah, I think there's some truth to that view. He also remained convinced that whatever we mean by the fall, whatever may have happened at the beginning of the human race, however you define that, it was a function of evolution. Okay? It was not something outside of the evolutionary picture, the evolutionary understanding. And that death itself is built into the fabric of the universe from before life, the potential for death. As long as there was a possibility of life, there was a certainty of death, in other words, based on the structure of matter itself. And in the course of the universe's development, that is eventually going to manifest itself as sin. And therefore, since this potential is built into the entire universe, that universalizes the need for redemption. So it gives a much more sweeping background to the whole idea of the incarnation and the redemption. It wasn't just God's plan B when God's plan A went wrong because this guy ate a piece of fruit and now Jesus has to come and be incarnated and crucified and all that just to repair the damage from that. No, it's a much bigger picture, a much more inspiring picture maybe, if you will, but something far grander than the traditional story. And I think Teilhard was exactly right about that. So he continued to wrestle with trying to work out more detailed models or theories of how the evolution of humanity might have proceeded, trying to answer the criticism that he was too vague about this. So he did his best to come up with a more detailed explanation. But in any case, in all cases, he excluded the idea of an individual Adam and Eve, an initial fall that caused all the problems, unless you mean it figuratively somehow, metaphorically or somehow, that there was maybe there was some kind of moral crisis at the first appearance of human intelligence. He could understand that, but again, he couldn't really get any more detailed about it. He saw his own thinking on this as an intellectual and mystical development of these foundational doctrines of the creation, the fall, whatever that is, the incarnation, and the redemption, which are, of course, the central ideas of Christianity, seeing them as all aspects of one and the same divine operation, not switching to plan B to repair the damage in the Garden of Eden. Evil, he thought, was the inevitable shadow side of creation by evolution, evolution being God's chosen means of creating. And he saw paradise as being in the future, just like the peaceable kingdom that Isaiah talks about and puts in the future. The paradise of the book of Genesis is also, and I think biblical scholars would agree with this, is if it's a picture of anything, it's a picture of the future, the kingdom of God, as Jesus phrased it. It's the future salvation in Christ. And I think that's a very modern view. That is pretty much what I believe, and what a lot of theologians whose names are known to you would also accept. So Teilhard was ahead of his time in that respect. Well, so time went on. 1950, Pope Pius XII came out with an important encyclical, Humani Generis, that people generally feel these days was more than anything else a response to this unpublished author by the name of Teilhard de Chardin. He was unpublished, but his works were so widely circulated and were having such an insidious effect even in seminaries that a public answer was required on this whole subject of human evolution. So, Pope Pius allowed as how it was permissible to believe in evolution, even the evolution of the human body, provided, and he had three important strictures here. Number one, you got to admit that it's still not proven. Well, in 1950, that horse was already out of the barn, and scientists were agreed that evolution was a fact, including evolution of humans. You had to believe that the soul, as distinct from the body, is directly created by God in each individual. And thirdly, that all humans are held to be descended from a single couple, from which we get the effects of original sin. So monogenism here was underlined in Humani Generis, which we can see was really repeating, now that we know what those 6 propositions said, was repeating those as though he still felt, well, of course, the propositions hadn't been made public. So there was still a need, I think, in the Pope's mind, at least, in the holy offices, to nail close that loophole, a perceived loophole, that proposition number 4 had been written to take care of. So those 6 propositions are present, at least in outline, in this encyclical. And the encyclical defends at some length the interest of the magisterium in strictly scientific statements as well as dogmatic ones. So this is really, without ever saying what Teilhard had to sign, putting that proposition 4 on record in unmistakable fashion. Assuming that it needed to be said, which obviously the Pope felt and the Holy Office felt. Okay, well, in 1950, Teilhard was still alive and kicking and writing, and he actually wrote a brief response to the encyclical, but of course, like everything else on this subject, he couldn't publish it. He argued that both monogenism and polygenism, which would have been our descent from a continuously large population, that these are theological concepts. They are not scientific. They are outside the realm of science and basically dogmatic in nature. That he is sort of splitting hairs here in terms of vocabulary, but he said that the proper scientific terms about these ideas would have been monophyletism and polyphyletism, trying to, at all costs, draw some kind of a line, at least in semantics, between the dogmatic teachings of the Church and scientific conclusions, and arguing that all we need for the human race to be one biologically is that we represent a single zoological stem. What we talk about to this day is as a monophyletic branch of the tree of life, you could say. And he went on to give arguments from biology against the idea that there would have been a single couple at the beginning of the human race. Well, that was in 1950. He died in 1955, and 45 years after 1950, it turned out he was proven correct as much as we probably can by studies in population genetics, showing that the idea of monogenism, whether it's scientific theory or theological theory. It's not biologically tenable. Could we have gotten 7 billion people on Earth today from one couple a few thousand years ago? Well, yeah, you could. You can run the numbers, and you could have that many people, but it wouldn't be the 7 billion that we actually have. Not the ones that we have today. Why? Because of the amount and kind of genetic variation that we have in the modern human population. This is the work of Francisco Ayala, a well-known population geneticist, former Catholic priest. The kind of variation he's talking about is what are technically called Transpacific polymorphism. What the heck does that mean? Well, you know, in genetics, you have a gene that may occur in different forms, slightly different varieties, one or two maybe base pairs different in the DNA, and so they may have different effects. Well, there are quite a few, and this is called polymorphism. In the human population, you have the same gene occurring in slightly different variant forms due to mutations in the past. Turns out that in a lot of cases, those particular variations in those particular genes are found identically in other species, like apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, whatever, our nearest ancestors, our nearest relatives. This is because, clearly, parsimoniously, those variations, those mutations first occurred in the common ancestor of those chimps and humans. All right, fair enough. But now when you look at the number of those polymorphisms that occur transpacifically, occur in both our species and some other species, they had to be inherited in the line leading to humans. Well, if you have one couple to begin with, you're getting the progeny inheriting only what is in those two individuals, the man and the woman. Well, you get one version of that gene from your father, the other version of the gene from the mother. So at most you can get 2 alleles, 2 varieties of that particular gene. Okay, but we have more than that in the present human population. So the bottleneck population, if there was a bottleneck, had to have been a lot larger than a population of 2 people. And Ayala runs the numbers on this and comes up with a minimum size of the bottleneck population to be in the hundreds, if not the thousands. In other words, there was never a human population as small as 2, one man and one woman. There always would have been a breeding population much, much larger, orders of magnitude larger than that, which is why he says that monogenism is no longer biologically tenable. We could not have the amount and kind of genetic variation that our species has and shares with other species like chimpanzees if there had been a bottleneck as small as 2 people. Okay, so Teilhard is vindicated on that point, even though he knew nothing really about population genetics. Okay, so he was ahead of his time on that. So the question is, suppose he had, is there something that could have been different here? And the question I posed in the title is, what went wrong? Could it have been different? Could he have successfully refuted his critics had said he didn't take sin seriously. Well, possibly if he had taken natural selection seriously. And we'll talk in a minute about how that helps to solve the problem. But he didn't, really. He overlooked that concept, and we have testimony on that point from no less an authority than George Gaylord Simpson, who himself was a paleontologist. He knew Teilhard. He considered Teilhard a friend. They had talked about this. And Simpson himself was one of the primary architects of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, bringing natural selection and population genetics together. That was in the 40s or so. And Simpson testifies that Teilhard never did grasp that concept. If he had, would it have been different? You like to think so, but I really don't think it would have, because you got to take history into account. When he lived, when this was happening in the 1920s, like I said before, even biologists were skeptical about natural selection. And so if he had tried to make an argument to the Holy Office based on natural selection, they would have turned around and said, hey, what are you talking about? Even your fellow biologists don't believe that Darwinian stuff anymore. So I don't think it would have changed history, even if he had thought about natural selection and come to what I would call a modern conclusion about it. So I think the collision was inevitable, unfortunately. So what does natural selection tell you about this? I've worked out a little diagram here to try to show the logic of it. Now, we recognize routinely two different kinds of evil. We talk about moral evil, which is sin. That's what you choose to do deliberately when you know you shouldn't. And then there's physical evil. Get to that in a second. So it's not new to say that sin or moral evil results from human intelligence and free will. What we can add to what the ancients knew is simply that those are products of evolution. Now, to explain physical evil, Teilhard, I think, already intuited this, but we now know, if we didn't know a century or more ago, that matter is made up of particles. You got molecules, atoms, subatomic particles, quarks, strings, whatever else the physicists come up with. It keeps getting smaller as you go down. But we know from experience anything that's made of parts can come apart. And when you think about it, what is physical evil? Basically, that is a catch-all term for any stuff that happens to us that we don't like. And without any obvious exception, those are cases where something physically comes apart. Your car blows a tire, or you get stabbed with a knife and it disrupts some of your internal organs, or you get zapped by a cosmic ray that causes a mutation in some cell in your body that ends up being cancerous, and then you die of cancer. So think about all the kinds of stuff that happens to you that you don't like, and if you go far enough back, it probably has its origin in something physically coming apart at the seams. So, knowing now what we do about particulate nature of matter, that implies that any kind of matter is going to be breakable, and that is what we basically mean by physical evil. Well, how does this connect with this? Is there any connection? Well, wait a minute now. One example of matter being broken in a way we don't like is genetic mutation. Most of them are, basically random, that cosmic ray zapping your DNA, and in most cases, that's not a good thing. It's a random change in your DNA sequence, not likely to be helpful, but once in a great while, it is helpful. And that turns out to be the raw material of evolution itself. That is what natural selection works on to produce evolution, which, among other things, has produced us with our intellect and will. Now, a byproduct of that process, since natural selection is about survival, we all have to be genetically programmed to seek our own survival and reproduction, because any organism that didn't wouldn't be around very long. It wouldn't survive, or if it did survive, it wouldn't reproduce and would become irrelevant to future evolution. So that inbred instinct, if you will, to look out first for number one, keep yourself supplied with whatever you need, and reproduce yourself, we can term that selfishness in the broadest sense, a non-pejorative sense, a self-centeredness, which is enforced by Darwinian natural selection there. So if things like this are inevitable results of the nature of matter in any imaginable to us material universe, then this process is going to occur. This is going to be programmed into us, and so when we get up here with our intellect and will, at least some of the times, we are going to do what we call sin. We're going to act selfishly in a way that harms others, that we know harms others, and we choose to do it anyway. Okay, human nature in a very literal sense. That's how I think of it anyway. Okay, consequence of that theologically is that you can't separate the possibility or inevitability of evil, both physical and moral, from the creative process that God evidently used to bring about life on this and presumably any other planet, and which God in the Bible calls very good. I don't see how a material universe could evolve any other way. This is going to be intrinsic to any sort of material creation. So when you turn around and look at this, it solves the problem, the ancient problem in philosophy we call theodicy, justifying the ways of God to man. How do we get around this horrible dilemma that we believe in a God who is all-powerful and at the same time completely good? Why doesn't God make the bad stuff go away? Why does God tolerate sin or sinners? Why is there even evil in God's good creation? Well, there's no choice about that. Either you create a material universe in which bad stuff is going to happen, or you don't create a material universe at all. You create something else, maybe, but not the kind of world that we live in. Okay, so coming back to 1546, fast in reverse here, what do we do with this traditional teaching in the Catholic Church? Propagation, not imitation. Okay? This idea of Imitation, remember, that was the view of the Pelagians at the time of St. Augustine, that it's all about bad example. And that was the position taken by the well-known theologians Rogers and Hammerstein in their treatise on the subject entitled South Pacific. To hate all the people your relatives hate, you've got to be carefully taught. True, right? Okay, that's the Pelagian view, that it's all about bad example, or at least a lot of it is. Okay. So that actually has been the popular view, as far as I can make out, among Catholic theologians since Vatican II. Dutch theologian Piet Schonenberg probably wrote more about this than anyone else. The idea that original sin is all the negative influences we absorb because we are all born into some sinful human society. We can't avoid having surroundings, having people around us that give us a bad example. Well, now is that really propagation or is that imitation? If we look at the way biologists conceptualize human development, you're familiar with it, you get the sperm and the egg combining at conception to form a new individual, then you've got 9 months or so of gestation, and then there's birth, and then you go on postnatally. And this is what we call the formation of the genotype. That is your individual DNA, half from your father, half from your mother. That is formed at the time of conception, and everything after that is the formation, the development of the phenotype, what appears, what is visible, what is observable to scientific study, if you will. That is the playing out of the genetic program that's in your genotype. So your DNA is finalized here, and then the instructions in your DNA are used to construct your body and how it develops from there until death. Well, now, what do we do with these? There are other terms that are not scientific terms, but are commonly used, like nature and nurture. So where do we draw the line between them? Nature, are we going to equate that with your DNA? And is everything after conception going to be nurture? Well, you could say that. That could include both gestation and birth, or maybe you want to put the dividing line somewhere else. And then you have these other terms, propagation and imitation. Well, this is certainly propagation, and after birth you can certainly have imitation, but again, where do you really want to draw the line here between them? It's kind of squishy. What conclusions can we draw from this? Well, actually, the argument I'm making, and others have made, where do we get this set of tendencies to do bad things that we've traditionally called original sin, or the effects of original sin? It's a mixture, I think we can agree, a mixture of genetic and cultural heritage. And coincidentally, that is a little bit closer to what Trent said than to the prevailing view in post-Vatican II Catholic theologians, as far as I can tell, who say it's basically cultural. Trent said it's strictly genetic. It's both, really. So what do we do with that? Another good thing about this understanding that I'm presenting here, It makes constructive use of science's understanding of evolution. It's not just something that the church has to come to a détente with or live with, but it actually makes use of scientific concepts, Darwinian, neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory, and that's a good thing, I think. And so this ancient problem of theodicy here, justifying the ways of God, it really turns out to be a pseudo-problem in philosophy. You don't need to worry about that anymore. It sort of gets God off the hook. There's no other way God could have done it. And so I think we need a better term than original sin. Even Cardinal Ratzinger, before he became Pope Benedict, admitted in his writings that original sin is really a lousy term because it's not sin in the same sense that actual sin is. You all learned that in the Baltimore Catechism. And I think most of you here probably remember the Baltimore Catechism like I do. So I think we need a better term for that. I've used the term original selfishness. Now, what do Grumet and Bentley in this paper conclude here? Well, Teilhard took the tack of defining monogenism as a theological rather than a scientific concept. That's in tension with what he said at another point earlier, that it could be proven or had to be proven or disproven by science. He regarded both of these as theological and acknowledged that his own understanding over the decades was growing and changing, and that of science generally, of course, is always improving, we hope, which really is, sorry, wrong buttons here. That's sort of in contrast with what Humani Generis said, Pope Pius XII's encyclical, which seems to regard the magisterial teachings in science as having a tension between them, if not an antagonism between them. So that's different to the direction Teilhard was going. And they say Teilhard lived this conflict in the depths of his own being, trying his best to remain obedient to the church authorities, didn't publish, at least publicly, accepted the legitimate exercise of power and authority in the church. But, that fourth proposition had not been defined before that, and requiring him to subscribe to it really looks like an illegitimate exercise of power. The Holy Office cheated a bit in the case of Teilhard in drafting that proposition. And he was charged with not taking sin seriously. He argued the opposite, that it's even more serious than we thought, coextensive with the created order. And he experienced himself how it feels to be subjected to illegitimate exercise of power. You may get stability in the institution in the short term, but at the cost of putting off real resolution of the issue for a long time. That's basically what happened. And now that we have the 6 propositions and a very detailed account of the history around them here, we have to acknowledge the church's intellectual and moral debt to Teilhard's work. And that's it. So thank you. And as an extra little thing here, I'll throw in, we have a surprise for you tonight. Maybe, I'm sure some of you know about this already, but we have a little project going, a petition, an online petition that will be directed to Pope Francis, asking that Teilhard de Chardin be declared a doctor of the Roman Catholic Church. There's no canonical requirement that you have to be canonized before you can be declared a doctor. It has worked out that way in history, but no necessity for it. So we're going to try to persuade the Holy Father of that, and if you would care to sign on, I'm told there's a computer in the back where you can add your name to the list of supporters of that idea. So I'll turn this back over to Kathy.
We're going to break first. I think, Sandra Jo, is the computer still working? Okay, because she has a computer there. If anyone hasn't signed it, it would be easy to do that in between times. So thank you very much, Daryl. Very interesting ideas. And certainly from a more scientific perspective than most that we've heard. We want to take a few minutes now. If you gather in groups of whatever size works, but more than 2 is probably good. And just to discuss what you heard and what you remember and what you don't remember and all of that. It was probably a lot if you haven't heard this before. But right, and we will come back after 10 minutes or so, and then you can ask questions or... Well, I hope you're having wonderful discussions, but like everything else, I think we're going to have to stop and maybe open the floor for questions and comments. And so, Daryl, why don't you come here, and I think we have some microphones maybe that I can pass around.
Pass that around. Okay. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Hi. Thank you very much for coming and giving the talk. I have a question. Did the Catholic Church, have they ever given up the 7 pages of the typescript that was sent, that was sent around? Do we have a copy of that anywhere?
I am not sure. I'd have to go through the Zygon article again to see what they say about that. That's a good question.
Yeah, I know where it is. Yeah.
Oh.
It is published. I think it's in Christianity. I think it's in Christianity and Evolution.
Okay.
So it is there, and it's really dense. And Teilhard never believed it anyway. Okay. He just said he was just talking to a bunch of theologians in Belgium and kind of off the top of his head thinking about how he could, counter this. And then they said, well, why don't you write something down and send it to us? So he did, and to 7 other friends, and put one in his desk drawer.
Okay.
Never leave your stuff in your desk drawer.
Thank you very much, Daryl. I was very interested in your comments about evolution and selfishness. Because as an astronomer, I'm, of course, interested in how we communicate with other possible civilizations. So you want to know how long could the technical civilizations last? And I think we represent probably what happens all the time with a technical civilization. We develop some very high technologies which have the potential to be destructive to ourselves, and and at the same time we don't. We still remain fairly selfish. So my guess is that technical civilizations like ours don't last too long. Maybe 1,000 years, 2,000 years, something like that, if we don't change our ways drastically. And the impact of that would be, if that were the case, that this kind of evolutionary picture is true on other planets, that our chances of making any contact with other intelligence is virtually nil.
Yeah, people have made that argument that there's a very narrow window of contactability of alien civilizations, and it's very unlikely that our narrow window will be simultaneous with some other species.
Yeah, particularly nearby.
That's the pessimistic view, I guess. You could argue that at least some fraction of the technological civilizations will manage to survive. So we can hope so.
You're good. Oh, sorry. Sean, go ahead.
Thank you very much for a very good presentation. It got my neurons going, I'll tell you that. But one thing I think that was copiously absent in what you were speaking about is the notion of a multiverse as opposed to a universe. Everything here seems to be predicated upon the milieu of humanity developing and existing essentially in a vacuum. If we believe in the spiritual realities, that we live in a multiverse as opposed to a universe, with other entities, saints, angels, what have you, impacting upon this system of ours, could that not give some explanation in addition to this as to the directions in which we've gone?
Well, would that really meet the definition of a multiverse? Because generally, multiverses are taken to be causally separate, so that one can't affect the other. Because if they could, then maybe you could prove that there were other multiverses. But in any case, the argument would apply just as it would apply to any other planet, it would apply to any other universe. Now, I hadn't thought about multiverses contacting or influencing each other, as you say, but I don't know that that meets the definition of a multiverse.
Well, perhaps we got some semantical differences here. The bottom line is, if you believe in the efficacy of prayer, prayer is from one dimension going to another, asking for something else to happen in this dimension. If you believe in the canonical process as to how a saint is made, miracles necessarily have to occur. And those miracles do not occur in a closed system, but necessarily are visited upon this system from an external system. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence of that, one could also speculate that as the good can come in, evil as well can come in, and the whole synthesis is a little bit more than what has been prepared here, or been presented here.
Mm-hmm. Well, that doesn't sound too different from the traditional view of our living in one reality and God and maybe the devil existing in another reality, and we can pray to God or to the saints or whatever, and God can intervene with us, or the devil can have influences on us. And putting it in terms of multiverses is logically pretty much the same, I would say. And we've always, believed that there is some kind of communication between us and God, certainly.
Well, case in point there is the fact that...
Let's move on to
just one real quick point there.
Okay.
Case in point is the fact that Teilhard himself prayed to be taken on Easter Sunday. And the fact of the matter is, he died on Easter Sunday, 1955, which seems to be proof positive that prayers were answered and intrusions happened.
I also believe we should pray. I don't know how the mechanism works exactly, but we've been told that we should, and I do.
Well, thank you for that wonderful presentation. I want to talk about evil for a moment, if we could, and I want to explore this fascinating concept of the breakability of matter as what we mean by evil. Everything are made of parts, as you said, and when things fall apart, that's what we mean by evil. But yet, at the same time, we require them to break apart, you're saying, because that is what mutation is. And so there's a necessity of evil in the world in order to create complexity, in order to allow evolution to take place. My question is, what does that mean for us when we arrive at moral human evil? Is there a sense of sin as necessary in that case to allow evolution to continue? Or is there a way of thinking about what mutation means for humanity, taking on different cultural forms, taking on new forms of concept that are the same sort of breaking free of things that prevent change from happening? So I'm wondering whether we can talk a little about, or if you wouldn't mind just sort of speculating on how that mechanism could work in moral evil.
Yeah, John Milton said that God can bring good even out of evil. And certainly people who commit moral evil can't foresee all the possibilities or the effects that will result from that, and some of them fortuitously may turn out to be good, just like mutations sometimes turn out to be good. So whether all the good that happens in the world results from somebody's sin, then we even have or used to have a passage in, I guess we still have a passage in the Easter liturgy. We're coming up to Easter in a few weeks. Oh, happy fault of Adam that gained for us so great a Redeemer. Okay, so that's been around as an idea for a long time. So good deeds can have bad consequences. Bad deeds sometimes have good consequences, even if the malefactor doesn't want it to happen. How much there is necessity in that in order to have good, I don't know if I'd want to push it that far. But a related question is, where does redemption fit into all this? What is, or how is the incarnation helping to bring about some greater good, the kingdom of God, the eschaton, the future paradise? And what I've said about that is that if you're just thinking in terms of neo-Darwinian evolution leading to human perfection or the kingdom of God or something like that, you kind of can't get there from here, because that selfishness is always going to be built in. Now, you might imagine a situation in which people stop being selfish, but then the cynics will say, oh, come on, that could never happen. I mean, we're programmed to be just the opposite. And so maybe the one ingredient that was really needed to get there from here, and was not a potential in the neo-Darwinian paradigm, maybe that was the reason that God had to become incarnate, to have a living, breathing human example of someone who was completely unselfish. So you can point to that and say, see, it can be done. So now we've got, among other things, we've got the example, we've got the teachings of Jesus as a guide to how we should be in order to gradually, change the course of the aircraft carrier or something, degree by degree, towards something better. What was I going to say? Lost the thought.
Can
there.
I respond to that a
Sure.
little about the incarnation? I don't. I guess I don't think about the incarnation just as Christmas, as Jesus being born into the world and being with us. I mean, that's a piece of it, but it's a cosmic thing. Christ embedded himself in matter at the beginning, and is with us. So that's the imminent Christ, and then there's the cosmic Christ that Teilhard talks about, who's in the future drawing us. So I think they're the things that move us. To me, that's redemption, is the movement away from the selfishness or whatever, the tendency towards sin is. that can help us to get free from it, get free from whatever the biology is doing to us. And the biology is good because it has helped to create us
Got
who
us
we
this
are.
far.
But there are, like even our brain, I think there are parts of our brain that, kind of pull us down, but other ones that pull us up. But it's the spiritual presence of Christ within and beyond, to me, that make a difference in, that's the redemption to me. I don't know. So, yeah, somebody else. Did you have a turn already? Yes, let me see. Is there somebody else? All right.
I view Christ at the top of a pyramid, and as we grow, I have a 3- and 4-year-old grandson and granddaughter, Minji and Keo, and I see total unselfishness. They're always thinking of each other and what they can do for each other. When do we start to become selfish as we grow? Do we do it because it's an internal thing, or do we see it with the people around us? Are we taught unselfishness? But it's neat to watch these two little children as they're growing, and I believe that Christ draws us closer to him as we watch our grandchildren and children grow.
Yeah, actually, when we're first born, we're the opposite of that. We're completely self-centered. We are not the least bit altruistic, and we have to be that way to, promote our own survival. It's great that your grandchildren are already learning the opposite by the early age of 3. That's wonderful. But yeah, you can be taught that. You can pick it up from imitating others if you're so disposed. Most of us, I don't think, become totally unselfish at that age. That's great, though. You're doing a good job as a grandparent, I guess. Sure.
I think when we talk about moral good and moral evil, I think we have to remember that the purpose is not to be clean, to be pure. It's to be loving. And if you think about the difference between innocence and goodness, I think that's really important here. You really can't be good and entirely innocent. You can't, because you don't know what you're choosing away from. And I do think that in some way that I haven't even begun to fathom yet, Jesus is an exception to that, but I'm not sure how. And I don't think I will ever be sure how, or any of us will ever be sure how. But I think it's really important to recognize that in some sense, God made the world because he wanted there to be freedom. And for there to be freedom, there have to be choices. And for there to be choices, one of those choices has to be better than the other. And for us to grow in freedom, we have to choose both ways at some point. That's what I believe.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, you have to be conscious of the choice for it to really count as merit, I guess. You don't just blunder into it. You have made a conscious choice, and that is what. Couldn't hear that.
You have to be on the other side of the fence. Yeah, you don't know unless you try. That's a good point. Okay, we have another question?
So you had the chart in physical evil and the breakability of that. So what was it breaking from to make it physically evil?
Just a second here. Find it again. There we are. So say again.
Meditation, you mean?
Yeah. So the breakability of the matter, the breakability of matter went to physical evil. So is there another place where it goes to physical good, or what fully encompasses that?
Well,
Back together again.
everything
In a new way.
physical is
That's good.
incorporated here. The point is to explain why there is bad stuff of two distinct kinds. It's not denying that there is also much good in matter. I mean, that's the presupposition of our whole discussion, that there has to be a basically survivable, good universe, if you want.
So is it as an image bearer that what causes us not to be a good image bearer of God is what is physically evil? And that's from that wholeness, that separation?
Well, what separates us from God is not any of this. It's this, our wrong choices. Like the lady was saying, it's when you become conscious of a choice between stealing my neighbor's banana because I want it and not doing so because I realize that's unfair to my neighbor. That is pleasing to God. That is a step in the right direction that God wants us to take as an exercise of our freedom.
But that's on the nurture side versus, I guess, the genetic, scientific.
Well, I mean, both genetics and learned behavior come into it. I don't think we need to dissect out which influences are genetic, which are learned, because we're awash in all of them, and the bottom line is we have free will at the end, and there are influences on us one way or the other, predominantly more one way than the other, maybe, but we get to choose.
I think, too, looking at it from Teilhard's idea of creative union, he thinks that, he sees everything, all of this evolution in terms of creative union, which means that what's happening is things are coming together to make wholes, new wholes. You talked about wholeness at one point. And so wherever we're breaking that apart, we're going in the wrong direction, And so that would apply up there. It applies down here. If we're going to break all the molecules apart into atoms, then we don't have anything very interesting.
Breaking the bonds of love, you could say.
So.
I want to get back to your vanquishing of the theodicy issue. If I understand you correctly, there are many forms of physical or natural evil, storms, microbes, earthquakes and whatnot. In one form, radiation generates mutations, which is the lifeblood of creative evolution.
Also chemicals, also, various causes of mutation.
Couldn't there be other forms that generate mutation, like copy errors that aren't as serious as radiation?
Yeah, there are all sorts of ways that you can have copy errors in reproduction of DNA molecules. You can have damage to a molecule that's already been formed. Various ways that you can alter the base sequence and induce some kind of a mutation. It doesn't really matter how it happens. The assumption is basically that these mutations, for better or for worse, are random with respect to adaptation. They don't happen. You don't get a beneficial mutation just because you happen to need that at the moment. That doesn't enter into it at all. It's the luck of the draw, and then you do the best you can with the DNA that you draw. And that goes on even after your birth. Like I say, you can have somatic mutations as well as germline mutations, and somatic mutations is what typically gives you something like cancer. So there are all sorts of, in something as complicated as the human makeup, there are countless things that can go wrong. It's surprising that any of us is halfway normal.
Well, I think maybe that should be our last question, but I must say that the discussion, the questions were very good, and nice variety. And so that's always a sign of a good talk, right? So, Daryl, thank you very much.
I'll just throw out one more quote I forgot to work in earlier about this business of breakability of matter by the late Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, who shortly before he died complaining, "I'm getting old and I'm falling apart." And that's what we eventually have to face.
That's right.
But that's another example.
That's after we've been pulled together in another way. There is a computer back there if anybody wants to sign the petition. If you've already done it, I guess you better not do it again, unless you want to sign it to somebody else, but that would be awful. All right, but
No stuffing the ballot
Let's
box. That
thank,
would be a wrong choice.
yeah, right. Let's thank Daryl one more time for a good talk.